Question: if God is almighty, could God create a rock that is so big that God can't lift it? This is a question that's been kicking around for a long time, and over the many years I've been on the spiritual path, I've met people who were quite confused by it. I've also met atheists who use this question to argue that the Almighty God doesn't exist because it doesn't make sense. And it's interesting because I just posted a video called Who Was the Original Creator? And in that video I talk about the limitations of the linear mind. And the very same day I watched something else where people brought up this question of God and the rock. And so I thought it would be fun to talk about it in connection with the linear mind. So the general principle I want to give you here is that as we go through life, we will be faced with some of these questions that seem like they are impossible questions. They are unresolvable questions. They are enigmas. And the general principle you can apply is, if you have a question that you can't answer, question the question. Question the question itself. You can question the formulation of the question, the wording used, but you can also question the assumptions that the question is based on. Because if you think about this, if you knew nothing, let's start with, if you knew nothing about a certain topic, if you know nothing about astrophysics, you can't really formulate a question about it, at least not a very detailed question. But you think, if you knew absolutely nothing, if you had been in sensory deprivation and you just emerged in a vacuum, you couldn't even formulate a question. In order to formulate a question, you have to have certain knowledge. And the knowledge usually implies that you're looking at the world a certain way and you are making certain assumptions. And it's based on these assumptions that you're formulating the question. So if you get yourself stuck with a question, it could very well be because your assumptions are not logical, consistent, or they are based on limited knowledge. So question the question. So I thought it could be fun just to think about this question. If God is almighty, could God create a rock so big that God can't lift it? And of course people are saying that if God is almighty, he should be able to create a very, very big rock. And if he can't create a really, really big rock, he is not almighty. And if the rock is big enough, then God shouldn't be able to lift it. So if God can't create that rock, he's not almighty. And if God can't lift the rock that he's created, he's not almighty either, it would seem. And this is where we need to talk about the linear mind. The linear mind, you can also call it the intellectual analytical mind, it always thinks in terms of a linear progression, cause and effect. So you have science, for example. You look at the universe, you realize that everything that's in the universe now came from a previous state. And that state then came from a previous state. So you have, for example, all the species that exist on Earth today, which if you go back through the evolutionary chain, they started with a single-celled organism that emerged out of the primordial soup. If you take the entire cosmos, you can go back to where all the matter, all the energy in the universe was compressed into what science calls a singularity. And then there was the Big Bang that exploded everything outwards. So this is the linear mind. It always wants to go back to some previous state. Whatever, as I was pointing out in the other video, the linear mind is very useful when it comes to practical things, but when it comes to certain bigger questions about life, the linear mind has limitations. And what that really means is that the linear mind can ask questions that the linear mind cannot answer. With a linear mind, you can ask a question that doesn't have a linear answer. And you can just think about this by thinking the Big Bang. Here we have this singularity that science is talking about. First of all, nobody can really understand or explain what a singularity is, and how all of the matter and energy that we see right now could be pressed into a singularity, which supposedly is an infinitely small point. But how can a point be infinitely small? But anyway, even if we say there is a singularity, the linear mind can always ask, as some scientists have already done, what was before the Big Bang? And then you can say, as some scientists have done, well, there was another universe, and that universe then got compressed into the singularity, and then when the singularity was reached, there was the Big Bang that created our universe. And eventually our universe will go into a, compress into a singularity and give rise to a new Big Bang. But the linear mind can then say, well, what was before the universe that created our Big Bang? What was before that Big Bang? What was the ultimate Big Bang? Because what you end up is in this what science calls an infinite regress. You can keep asking what was before. The same thing with numbers. You start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can supposedly go on indefinitely. But since you don't have an indefinite amount of time, can you really say that you can keep counting indefinitely? Is it meaningful? So, so that's why I'm saying the linear mind has a certain limitation. It's very useful for practical things. It's not really useful for the big questions in life. So let's go back to this. Can God create a rock so big that God can't lift it? What are the assumptions here? Well, first of all, there is the assumption that God is almighty. And this is an assumption that comes from the theistic view of God, which is based on the Old Testament. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all have this theistic world view that God is almighty. Is that really a sound assumption? Is it a necessary assumption? I have a video that's called How the World Was Created, and in that video I talk about how our world originated with one being that I prefer to call the creator to avoid the associations with a theistic God. So there was a creator that started the creation of our universe. But then that creator created self-aware extensions of itself, namely us. It sent us into its creation, the world of form it had created, and gave us free will. And by giving us free will, God essentially, the Creator, gave up its almightiness, because it said, I am allowing you, who are extensions of myself, to do whatever you want in this world of form. So instead of this angry being in the sky that theism proposes, there is a God who says, I will not micromanage you and what you're doing. I will give you free will, and this means we have the free will to deny that there's any kind of God, to deny that we originated from something, to deny that there's any deeper explanation or meaning to life. We have the right to do this, and God is perfectly fine with this. So this is one thing you can question. The entire question about the rock doesn't make any sense unless you base it on the theistic worldview that God is supposed to be almighty. And we can actually observe that God has set aside its almightiness. We can say if God created the entire universe, it must have pretty extensive creative powers, right? But apparently you can see that God doesn't micromanage us, because you can deny God or curse God or whatever, and you're not hit by a bolt of lightning. So God must have set aside its almightiness. But then the other thing we can say is that in the video I'm talking about, How the World Was Created, the view of God that I'm presenting there is that the Creator is beyond the world of form. It's beyond its own creation. The creation, the world of form is created out of the Creator's being, but the Creator's being is more than the creation. That means God is the Creator is the originator of form, but the Creator is beyond form. You can't put any form on the Creator. It's meaningless. And this means that could God create a rock so big that God can't lift it? Well, if you think about this, even with a linear mind, what is a rock? It's something that has form. Any form is finite, limited. You cannot have a form that's infinite, because then you have no form. In the Big Bang, if it ever existed, there's no form there. That's the whole idea of science. There is no form in the Big Bang. And in the beginning, the first seconds of the Big Bang, there was no matter. There was nothing that had form. It was just outward movement. And so what I'm saying is that a rock must, by its very definition as something that has form, have a finite size. So if you say, now science has shown how vast the universe is, billions of light years across. So if you imagine, could God create the biggest rock? Imagine the biggest rock that God could create. The biggest rock that could be created would potentially fill the entire universe. But the universe is still finite in form or in size. So that means that a God that is infinite or beyond form, well, could of course lift a rock that filled the entire universe. But of course you could also say, how could God lift any rock if God doesn't have form? I have a physical body. A rock is a physical thing. Yeah, I can lift a rock. But God doesn't have a physical body because God is beyond form. So it's meaningless to even say that God should be able to lift a rock. You could say God could create a rock and God could uncreate a rock. But saying that God should be able to lift it is meaningless. So I'm just trying to show you here that a general principle you can apply when you run into these questions is to question the question itself and question how the linear mind sets you up. The linear mind can set up these questions that the linear mind can't provide an answer to, and that means that if you think about the answers, you end up getting very confused. And basically you could say that if you keep using the linear mind to look for this ultimate cause, you won't find an ultimate cause, but you might find yourself in a straitjacket. Because people have literally gone crazy thinking about these kind of things. But what I'm saying is, it's because the linear mind has created an impossible question, a question that really doesn't have an answer. But people insist on trying to solve the enigma by using the linear mind. And that's why they end up in these catch-22. It's like the Gordian knot. I don't know if you ever heard about the Gordian knot, but there was in ancient Greece, there was a temple. And somebody, don't ask me why, but somebody had taken a bunch of ropes and tied them together in this very intricate knot. And it was tied in such a way that all the ends of the ropes were hidden. So, in other words, normally to loosen the knot, you start looking for an end, and you start pulling on that end and unraveling the knot. But there were no ends to pull on. And then, again, don't ask me why, but some oracle had come by, looked at the knot, and prophesied that he who could undo the Gordian knot would become ruler over all of Asia. And for centuries, ambitious people who apparently, again, don't ask me why, wanted to rule all of Asia, they flocked to this temple and they tried to undo the knot by pulling on the ropes. Then, centuries later, a guy named Alexander came by. He takes a look at the knot. He goes, yeah. Then he takes his sword and he cuts the knot in half. And therefore, he has fulfilled the prophecy. Because the prophet didn't say he who can untie the knot. It said he who can undo the knot. And so Alexander undid the Gordian knot, and he then proceeded to conquer all of Asia, for which he became known as Alexander the Great. So this is again an example of how the linear mind had created the Gordian knot, and you couldn't solve it through the linear mind. You had to step outside the linear mind. And this is another very important, if you're a spiritual person, it's very important to realize that you can't think your way into heaven. I'm not saying that the linear mind isn't useful on the spiritual path. It is. We study spiritual teachings, we increase our understanding. But the linear mind itself will not get you to a real spiritual goal. It will not help you raise your consciousness or transcend the material realm. In order to really transcend, you have to realize that the mind has two capabilities. There's the linear mind and there's the intuitive mind. And in order to solve the bigger questions, in order to really raise your consciousness, you have to use the intuitive mind. You have to get what you can call intuitive experiences, mystical experiences, aha experiences, eureka experiences, non-dual experiences. That's what is really going to give you the breakthroughs on the spiritual path. And I have met people over the years who spent decades studying a spiritual teaching intellectually, but they didn't really grasp the need to go beyond the intellectual study and have the experiences. So there are actually people who have a very good intellectual understanding of a spiritual teaching, and they can quote it and they can explain it, but they haven't actually experienced, they haven't had a mystical experience basically. So they haven't really, and what I mean with a mystical experience is, which I've also explained in several videos, that you're experiencing a reality that is outside your own mind. And you experience that that reality is more real than the contents of your own mind. So I've explained in several videos that the human mind has 4 layers. There's the highest layer is the sense of identity. Below that is the mental level where our thoughts are. Below that is the emotion level where our feelings are. And below that is a part of the mind that's physical, that's the brain, using or running the body. And these 4 levels of the mind, they form a mental box. And there are all kind of contents in the box. I call them subconscious cells, but also beliefs, your worldview is also part of this mental box. So normally, our normal experience is that we, the core of our beings, is inside that mental box, and we are looking at life through the filter of that box. So we have a perception filter. It's like putting on colored glasses that colors everything. But when I talk about a mystical experience, it is that the core of our being, which is something I call the conscious you, it's just a name, but the core of our being steps outside of our normal mental box and then experiences a reality outside the mental box. And we realize that the way we normally look at life is just one way to look at life. It's not the only way, partly because other people have different ways, because they have a different perception filter, but also because there is a way to look at the world without any perception filter. And essentially, the spiritual path is that you gradually clear out all of the perception filters, all the coloring in your mind, until you can achieve this neutral awareness where you're just observing the world without what I call these dualistic value judgments that I talk about in several videos. So what I'm saying is that, to return to the question, people had a certain mental box that caused them to look at God a certain way based on the theistic worldview. And the question is formulated from inside that mental box. And from inside the mental box, it has no answer. Only by stepping outside the mental box, and as I said, experiencing that the Creator is not a finite being. The Creator is not an almighty tyrant sitting up there on a great white throne in the sky. Only then can you resolve the question. So what I'm saying is there's a difference between answering a question and resolving a question. So you can say, you can formulate a question with a linear mind, and the linear mind wants an answer that's based on its linear worldview, that there was always something before, and there must be an ultimate cause. Or you can experience a reality that isn't linear. And when you do that, the question becomes obsolete. It's still not answered within the linear mental box, but you just see that the question was based on a limited view, and now that you have the larger view, the question just fades away. So you see what I'm saying? There are some questions that are asked by the linear mind. They do have linear answers because they relate to the physical world. But there are some questions that the linear mind can formulate do not have a linear answer. And the only way out of being confused by these enigmas is to have an intuitive experience. So you directly experience it, not a matter of intellectual understanding, but directly experiencing. There's a reality beyond what the linear mind can fathom, and therefore these questions are just, they're obsolete for you. You're not, your mind is not tying itself into knots anymore to resolve these questions.